So I wanted just to concentrate on one aspect of that, which is the teaching of biography, which should concern, I'm sure, many people in the room tonight. Certainly that's something that's decisively developed in my time. There have been also surprising developments in America and to some degree in France and Germany, although interesting, the French are very hesitant about teaching biography for some quite interesting historical reasons, I think. In Britain, the University of Buckingham founded, I think, what was there the first course, 1998, and this was closely followed by the University of East Anglia, which you remember is been famous for years for its creative writing course. Since 2000, they set up a life writing course, and this was under Lorna Sage, whose work many of you will know, and also the novelist and critic Sir Malcolm Bradbury. And the bitter irony of that was as that was being set up, both of them fell ill, and both of them died, and they never lived to see that life writing course, and there's particular irony in that. And I recently met the young woman who would have been Lorna Sage's first biographical pupil, and she did do some seminars with her. She's now a very successful young radio broadcaster, and she told me that Lorna extraordinarily experienced that Lorna never spoke of her own illness at all, but, and I quote, she sometimes wept over the unhappiness of other lives, which those seminars must have been quite extraordinary, I think. So the University of East Anglia finally appointed what was its first professor of biography. This is a working writer, not an academic, and that was in the following year, 2001, and that happened to be me. It was the first and only academic post I've had in 40 years, and I was so shocked when I accepted it that I was invited to lecture on it in Oxford, and the title of my lecture was The Biographer Who Came In From the Cold, which somehow, and now that I'm just finishing, I'm thinking of having a lecture which is called The Biographer Who Got Out of the Kitchen. I think it's something like that. But I did have initial doubts about what effect having biography as an academic subject, what effect this might have, but I actually now think that it won't. My fear was it would somehow paralyze biography with theory, with academic theory. I don't think this is going to happen at all. On the contrary, it seems to me that it's actually helping to create a new future for biography and sending forth a new generation of young writers, and especially here in Australia, we'll come back to that, who will go forth and multiply, biographically speaking, that is. And for that reason, I will, in a moment, towards the end, I will give you my 10 properly biblical commandments for young biographers. And I'll give you that in a moment. We, at the University of East Anglia, we put forth a kind of mission statement. We conceived the course much more like a fine arts course, in the sense that we recognized that there were masters in this form that needed studying, and also that practice, my students were all required to write all the time, to try out types of biography. Here's just the beginning of our mission statement. This is a pioneering course designed for enthusiasts who may want to write biography as well as study it. Together we will explore the history and the controversies of the genre, building up a working library of key texts and criticism from Plutarch and Boswell to contemporaries like Peter Ackroyd and Claire Tomlin. So we had a very, very broad reach, and I was determined to start with the classical biographers. We will discuss ideas of cultural myth, human empathy and identity, notions of celebrity and failure, and the enormously different ways in which men's and women's life stories can be shaped, narrated, and interpreted. Students will study the formal discipline and changing methods of biographical research, and they will discover, most importantly, the value of comparative biography and look at postmodern experiments, beginning with Strachey and Virginia Woolf, where fact and fiction, the famous granite and rainbow, perilously meet. And then I go on to describe the exercises and so on. And the comparative biography, I will say a word about that in a moment. One of the things, the principles of the course, was to avoid ageism. And so many, the young creatives, they were all in their 20s. And it seemed to me that this limited the course. So I insisted that we had a very broad intake, and every year we had people in their 20s, we also had people in their 60s, we had the entire age range. And what happened, those seminars became one generation talking to another, and that's quite extraordinary effect. And I believe there was no other seminar, really, in the university which worked quite like that. And the cross-section of students was, again, extraordinary. I composed a little list. This is 1 year. A doctor, a barrister, a woman barrister, criminal barrister, a financial journalist, a housewife, a TV researcher, an ex-headmistress of a very superior girls' school. That was a very interesting student to have. A social worker, a company director, a taxi driver, a primary school teacher, a Pakistani Air Force pilot, a Japanese retail manager, a woman, and a Nigerian poet, a wonderful man. And one of them remarked, and I still can't remember, I think it may have been the poet, he said to me, presumably the CV is the only chance I'll get to write fiction on this course. It had the right spirit immediately. And now it's a wonderful thing. I have a sense of them going out now, going forth and multiplying. I used to try and tempt the poets away from the creative writing courses. I said, come and study something real, get tangled with life. And they did, and they were often the very, very best students, and they abandoned creative writing, and they came across to life writing, which actually for them, it was superb. It supplied them with wonderful material. Just for instance, one of those is now the head of the Writers' Project of the British Library Oral History Department, appointed 2 years ago. Several of them have published their own books, although I always said to them, publishing your own books is not necessarily the result of this course for you. It does many other things. But it, of course, is very pleasing when that happens. And I'll give you one example. My Pakistani Air Force pilot, whose name was Mohammed Hanif, he, as a result of writing an essay on Plutarch and tyrants, and how Plutarch handles tyrants, biographically speaking, and particularly the kind of dreams that tyrants dream and the record of those dreams, how important they are in classical biography. And comparing that with modern lives of General Zia-ul-Haq, you remember, who was blown up in a plane. That was his major essay for me. As a result of which, he went off and wrote a wonderful novel called A Case of Exploding Mangoes, which last week was on the Booker Prize long list. So it's extraordinary how that nugget of biographical learning can then expand and go in different directions. One of the major things I think we learned was that no biography, however good, is definitive. And I just want to give you a little momentary relaxation and picture show just to indicate this. Very, very simple pedagogical device, this. There are at least 8 outstanding lives of the great 18th century feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. But they're all different. Same subject, very, very different interpretations. And I want just visually to look at this. That's the original John Opie, lovely painting, now in National Portrait Gallery, painted when Mary was just about to marry William Godwin, the philosopher. She'd written The Rights of Woman, she'd written about her Scandinavian travels. In fact, she was pregnant when that picture was painted. It's tender, but it's also got great sort of sense of character, I think. 1797, and as you will know, Mary, of course, died shortly after in childbirth. The child was Mary Shelley, and William Godwin, kept that portrait above his desk for the rest of his life. It's a very powerful biographical image. Now, Godwin wrote a memoir, in fact, a short biography, an outstanding piece of work of his wife, of Mary Wollstonecraft. All I want you to look at is the image. It's clearly based on that, but it's been very softened, very romanticized. And that is one of the criticisms of Godwin's biography, that he made Mary into a kind of romantic figure and didn't take enough attention of her intellectual capacities. An interesting critique. Anyway, just that frontispiece indicates that, perhaps. There's Claire Tomlin's book, using the same image, this almost 100 years later, classic piece of biographical writing, 1974, but the way it's cropped, it does something else. It makes Mary's image firm. And what I'm now telling you is that the covers give some response to the different image of the subject, and it's very, very different. That's a more recent biography by Janet Todd, who's edited all Mary Wollstonecraft's work. And curiously, that goes back, it's much closer to the Godwin sentimental image, although the book, any of you will know it, is actually rather a fierce biography, quite critical of Mary. And my private opinion is that the publishers were rather frightened of this, and they put this much softer image on it. But the story doesn't quite end there. That's another earlier Opie painting of Mary when she was still a schoolmistress, very different in character. There's very interesting hands there, quite fierce, quite Amazonian. And that image then was taken by Janet Todd when she edited Mary Wollstonecraft's letters, closed it up, but made it much fiercer again. So the image once more changes. This is a very interesting study by Barbara Taylor, a very fine feminist writer, who found another Opie picture. I have to say that's my favourite in a way, because it shows Mary the writer. There she is, clearly in the study, bandana around her head, with the manuscript, we wonder what of which book, and that very wonderful intense gaze, suddenly looking at you like that. Very, very striking, and that reflects the nature of that study. The most recent one by South African writer Lyndall Gordon, biographer taught at Oxford, and again taking the same image but by cropping it, by going close in, suggesting this is a much more intimate biography, which indeed it is. She's much more interested, particularly towards the end of Mary Wollstonecraft's life, when she travels in Scandinavia. Some of you will know that wonderful book, My Journeys in Scandinavia, based on her letters. And of course, as a result of which she comes home and twice to commit suicide. So it's a very intense experience recorded in that travel journal. And the book concentrates in a way on those aspects. And again, very simple point I'm making here of how the cover indicates that a different image, a different interpretation is being made. And that's where I republished the Godwin's original biography in a series which I ran partly for my students, classic biographies, and there we went back, it's the original text, the very first edition, and we combined various images there in a kind of modern lino cut, and that's of course the Delacroix picture, remember, Liberty on the barricades in France, so to indicate very strongly the political nature of that career. So that very, very quickly, there is a device for showing how comparative biography needs to be studied, needs to understand what the form can do. That course that we launched there has now been followed up in Oxford. Hermione Lee runs a wonderful course there. At London University, partly taught by the poet laureate Andrew Motion, a very interesting one at Queen Mary College, run by the distinguished scholar of 17th century scientific writing, Lisa Jardine, very interesting there, who's actually the daughter of Jacob Bronowski. So again, biography now being brought in a scientific way, and we'll come back to that. And at the University of Kingston, just last year, the Centre for Life Narratives has been founded there, and there, if you remember that, there's a very interesting mission statement on their website, which you can go to directly. And my last point there is that I noticed that even the August Royal Society in London, the great centre for science ever since 1664, or is that the date of the beer? I can't remember, it's 1660. That society, who's always been rather opposed to the notion of biography, because that is not the purpose of the body of scientific knowledge, and the only form their librarian told me recently they recognised was the obituary, which seemed to be rather nice. But in fact, I learned they've got an anniversary coming up, 250th anniversary, the year 2010, And they are going to launch exactly that, a biographical series called Memories in Science. So even there, the news, the good news has arrived, I think. And of course, those developments, no way have those been restricted to Britain. And far from it, because here, I think the first course in biography anywhere in the world was at Griffith University. In the 1970s it was started. And of course the National Library of Australia has had their oral history project, which began in the 70s at the same time. There are biography courses at Monash, at La Trobe, I think since the 1996. There's now La Trobe sponsors a biography prize. There's the Biography Institute that Ian Donaldson was talking about, founded at Canberra in 2005. And of course that organises these worldwide conferences where writers and biographers, academics come in to discuss various issues. So I feel, once again, here in Australia, you have the sense that you're making the lead here. And it's very impressive that is so. Just to give a tiny, very brief, just to close that, overview, that I looked at the kind of things that are being discussed in these international conferences, and here's some of them. I think there's a great interest in what is the significance of the contemporary cult of celebrity that we're surrounded by, which generates all these extraordinary pseudo-biographical forms like Facebook and so on. What's going on here? Why do people want to put their stories out? And this almost meltdown of the notion of privacy, that your private life becomes so quickly public. That is a very interesting area to discuss. The impact of biography, which I mentioned a little bit, on the other media, a film we mentioned, but of course obviously on television, on photography, on portraiture and so on. And incidentally, hot press on ballet. There's a ballet in production in Paris at this very moment, which is it's heralded, it's flagged up as a biographical ballet on the life of George Gershwin. Brilliant idea to take George Gershwin's music and turn it into an account of his life, which is a dance biography, a first, I think. There's a very interesting, this is also much discussed, the impact that biography and biographical narrative has had on history writing, political history writing. A very interesting essay written by the Australian historian Peter Cochrane on this very subject, saying that rather impressively, I thought, that he was influenced as much by British biographical writers in storytelling, not in the actual history, but in the storytelling, people like Simon Sharma, in the way he now set out to write political history. There's also the whole question of biography as a kind of bridge or an access point to fields of specialist knowledge, to, say, philosophy or the physical sciences, and I'll come back to that, a very important area. I've mentioned that shift in exhibitions which have used biographical approaches to build around portraiture physical objects. They call this object biography, in order to lay out a particular story. Photography, video loops, sound archives, all built around. So a very different way now of presenting exhibitions about themes or groups using biographical techniques. And finally, I think discussed a lot, and these are difficult issues, there are major questions, ethical questions, about the invasion of privacy, the protection of privacy, and the whole, in fact, a philosophical problem, not merely privacy, but the question of how, quite simply, how far can one human being understand another? And this is one of the age-old questions in epistemology. And we come back to that again and again. In biography, you come up to it again and again. It's the rock in the water that you hit. And I will refer to that again briefly. It's interesting, I've been arguing that this great expansion that is reflected by the university courses also is reflected in books about biography. I had a look at the subject index at the British Library. There are currently 363 books about biography, that is to say, not biographies, about biographical form. But the really interesting thing about this is that 80% of those titles were published since 1990. So there's a sudden expansion there. And I think just there probably, I picked out a few there. The ones in red are published over here. They're Australian collections and studies. And there are very different kinds. Some of them are collections of essays, some of them are very personal accounts. The Michael Holroyd there, the Brenda Nile life class, and that rather comic 9, How to Do Biography, a Primer, from the USA. Somehow there's something, that title must have an American accent to it, doesn't it? How to Do Biography, a Primer. It's actually not, as we would say in England, not as naff as it looks. It's actually quite an interesting book there. I think also that out of the biography courses, we see that there is a kind of humanist discipline, the subject of biography, which combines both the critical spirit and the imaginative one, and it keeps an eye on what's happening around us. What I've referred to as the para-biographic forms, which are multiplying so rapidly. And you'll find it everywhere. If you look at a CD sleeve now, you will find a miniature biography of either the musician or the composer there. If you look at paperback novels, you will often find now, suddenly, there's an entire biography of the author at the back, tucked in, author interviews. Very extraordinary in a way. It's crept up on us. Internet blogs, entire subject on its own. I can't keep count. My latest thing, I think the latest statistic on this is that there are 110 million blogs out there. Okay, so an extraordinary expansion going on there. And of course, looking at it as a student, one would also say, how do you compare that to what's happening to the old traditional exchange of the written letter? How do you balance those two, and those two sources? So all those things, as students, got my students to study, but we all now are, as working biographers, aware of that. But above all, I think I found myself thinking again about the craft of biographical narrative, of storytelling. And that's just the next, my third subject. I just wanted to say a word about that. It's often claimed that, I've seen this in several essays, that the future of biography lies in radical changes of form, that the biographical narrative must be fractured, it must be postmodern, it must come at you in broken voices. And I suppose here in Australia, the great example of that was Brian Matthews' book, which many of you know, that experimental book, prize-winning book, Biography, Louisa, about Henry Lawson's mother, written indeed in a very Poe-Mo, as we call it, style, multiple biographic voices. The biographer turns out to be both a man and a woman, and talks to Louisa and so on. And so a general sense of shaking the cage of biography, what can we do with this form? It won a whole series of prizes. I think people are slightly rethinking it now, but it is a significant and a brave book. And what interests me is that came out in 1987, and it looks as if right at the end of the 80s, there was a kind of burst of this kind of experiment, trying to see how far we could bend the classical notion of biography as a straight chronological sequence. And might just draw to your attention, many of you will have read Peter Ackroyd's Dickens. Do you remember that huge, almost Victorian-style biography, but with those fictional interludes in them? Ackroyd suddenly starts talking to the young Dickens in a fictional chapter, or indeed he talks to Chatterton and so on. And those are dropped into the book. And quite interesting that since it's been republished, it's been shortened and the fictional sections have been taken out, publisher's decision. I'm not sure if that was a good one, but that 1989, that again, this 5 or 6 years of experiment, this is the same period, another book, Julian Barnes's Flaubert's Parrot, which of course is a novel, but it uses genuine biographical research about Flaubert, and it invents a fictional biographer, Henry Braithwaite, and ties very interesting knots with research and chronology and stands them on their head. So it's a sort of parabiography, that novel, and very brilliantly done, I think. And I would just put in there that book of mine, Footsteps, Adventures of a Romantic Biographer, I see it now falls into that same period of the late 80s. And there I was trying to break the frame. It's 4 narratives, but in which the biography, as it were, steps out of the frame at various points and tries to explain what he's doing and also what things he gets wrong, which seems to me a very important part of the story. Nonetheless, having said all that, I think that the traditional art of storytelling will always be central to biography and its power. And what we need, perhaps more, is a change of subjects and the development of the ideas of what kind of materials biography can deal with, rather than artificially tinkering with the form itself. And I'll come back to that in a moment. It seems to me, very much when you study the development of the form, that even with many biographies right from the beginning, Suetonius and so on, are not presented chronologically, but they always have a powerful human storytelling at its centre, what the Greeks would call an action, an agon, and that's always there in any of the parallel lives of Plutarch. He, of course, launched what I think of as the great sort of melodramas of biography. That's a prime Alexander, the great leader and general who goes to self-destruction. It's not no enemy ever destroys him. He destroys himself. It's a sort of archetypal model for biography, that self-destruction. Julius Caesar's assassination, the idea of the enemy within that destroys a great man, and the subtle complications of that. And of course as it were, the first great biographical love affair, Antony and Cleopatra's fatal love affair. And of course, with my students, I get them to read that and immediately send them straight to Shakespeare to read Antony and Cleopatra. And there you see Shakespeare using word for word, sentence to sentence, just with brilliant little adjustments, Plutarch's text in Roger North in the Elizabethan translation. And that's a very early example of a really powerful biography having this knock-on effect. It can go into another media and be transformed. Which is one of the things that gives its power. But all to say that depends on powerful storytelling. Just a word about that. When I say storytelling, of course, I don't mean fictionalizing at all. What I mean is that a biographical narrative will have a protagonist, not necessarily one, but we'll start with one, a time sequence, a plot, and a dramatic pattern of human cause and effect. The discipline is essentially secular, and that is to say, explanations in biography cannot depend on deus ex machina, although, of course, one of the great subjects of, say, if you're writing 19th century biography, is religious belief and what impact that had on lives, and particularly the failure of religious belief. Very interesting thing and difficult to write about. But that the form, the frame which you must write within, has to be secular in some sense. We can no longer write hagiography, lives of saints. It no longer satisfies us. There's also, and I'm talking again about what I mean by storytelling, there's a particular rhythm, I think, in good biographical narrative. There's an element of a suspense and mystery, and then resolution, explanation. That a piece of behaviour, or indeed even a poem, is like a mystery, and there's some attempting to resolve, to some degree, how that got written and why the writer wrote it. So there's a kind of rhythm to that. And there's, of course, that basic structure of the anecdote, which you can see threaded on the narrative like beads on a string, but of course not necessarily in chronological order. There are various things that you may want to do with that. And you're also, when you're looking at biographical narrative, you come very quickly against problems such as how reliable are your sources, how reliable is human memory, how can you get 3 or 4 accounts of exactly the same event, and then more subtly, how can you write in your narrative, he thought, she felt. What's the evidence for that? So just attempting to write good story leads you to these kinds of problems. There is an aside here, which I won't develop, the French school of criticism of the whole notion of narrative. And there's a very interesting exchange, it's largely theoretical, but between what they would call les Anglo-Saxons, who are very confident that narrative is a genuine force, and their criticism, which starts with indeed Sartre, and certainly with Barthes and Derrida, that says that it is a fictional form, it actually distorts reality. So that exchange goes on, and I should say that I noticed that Professor Donaldson gave a wonderful lecture based on that at La Trobe a couple of years ago, which he called Matters of Life and Death, and he went through some of these attacks very amusingly, and then answered them with specific biographies. And that's well worth looking up, that essay. It's republished in the ABR.